From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A Georgia grand jury report, partially released to the public on Thursday, says one or more witnesses may have committed perjury in testifying about the 2020 election result and the efforts to overturn it. What does that mean for Donald Trump's candidacy and some of his associates? We'll talk about that. Also, as a spending and debt showdown looms in Washington, the Congressional Budget Office interjects a note of fiscal reality with its annual budget review. The U.S. fiscal position has grown much worse in the last 2 years as the government has expanded enormously. And meanwhile, tax revenue has also hit one of its highest levels ever as a share of the economy. Will any of this reality intrude rudely into the coming fiscal debate? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here with Kate Batchelder and Kim Strasso. Welcome to you both. Let's talk about the grand jury report first. As I said, one conclusion there is that we find by unanimous vote, this is based on the excerpt, that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. That's one of the conclusions in this heavily redacted partial report that was released by the judge presiding over the grand jury. That grand jury was impaneled in order to investigate whether or not crimes were committed in attempts to overturn the election. And the other conclusion is that a majority that's worthy of note, I think, is a majority of the grand jury believes that perjury may have been committed by one or more witnesses testifying before it. The grand jury recommends that the district attorney seek appropriate indictments for such crimes where the evidence is compelling. Kim, I guess this suggests that some people may be in legal peril if the district attorney moves ahead based on this grand jury recommendation.
Agreed. Although what I find really interesting, Paul, is that what they're going to get them on if they do is perjury or lying to the grand jury. Implicit in this report, assuming that we don't get more of it, apparently this is only a portion, you would think that they would have put out the top lines, though. But remember, this was impaneled, as you said, to see if people engaged in crimes in attempting to overturn an election. Now, we have argued that simply floating different legal theories or questioning results doesn't count as a crime. Apparently, the grand jury, it would seem, has come to the same conclusion. But instead, it sounds as though some people may have not been as truthful as the grand jury would have liked in recounting their actions or what they related in some way. And so you're going to get the grand jury version of lying to the feds here, it sounds like. So again, we'll see where it is and we'll see who it is. Not quite sure what this means for Donald Trump and his campaign. The finding that the election was not stolen. I mean, it's good to see the grand jury say this, but that had already been demonstrated quite ably by elected officials, including Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in the state of Georgia well before now.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kim. I don't think Donald Trump actually testified before the grand jury. I mean, I think he took the Fifth Amendment, didn't he?
I believe that's true, but I do believe that a number of people in his orbit did go and speak to that jury.
Yeah. Now, of course, we're speculating here because we don't have any more information. There are no specific names in the grand jury release, but we thought we'd mention it today on the podcast because it's getting an awful lot of attention in the press. And there has been enormous anticipation about the release of this report. But I think that it's fair to say that the news release today does not move the ball all that much. We're going to have to see what happens moving forward if there are actually any indictments. All right, let's move on to the budget. Kate Batchelder, you're not quite as geeky as me, much more grounded person. But when it comes to these budget numbers, but you do follow them, what's your big takeaway from what CBO said?
Yes, Paul, now on to the glamorous material. This budget outlook, the big takeaway is one, that it's noticeably worse than even just last year. CBO is predicting $3.3 trillion more in debt than it did last May, about $2 trillion of that due to legislation. So we have public debt that is set to reach about nearly 120% of GDP by 2033. And that's, Paul, if they do no more harm, if they don't blow out spending further with new entitlements, child tax credit, more climate spending, Obamacare subsidies. So we have a spending picture. And so that debt we see going way up, basically because we have a mismatch between a tax ledger and a spending ledger. It's not hard to understand. Taxes are about 18% of the economy, which is really above its historical norm, but within that range. So we can't attribute what's going on here to insufficient taxation, but it's the spending side. It's 24.6 of the economy. I mean, nearly a quarter, just way above the norm of 21%. I mean, if you're taking in 60 trillion over a decade and spending 80 trillion, you don't need a PhD in economics to know that you have a problem. So I think the takeaway is just we are really putting the gas pedal on our fiscal problems, and they're just developing more acutely and more quickly than the public may appreciate.
Let's break it down first on the revenue side. Actually, in fiscal 2022, which ended in September, tax revenues as a share of the economy reached almost 20%, 19.6%. That compares with the 50-year average of only 17.4%. What that shows, I think, is that, of course, we've had a strong revenue bounce because of a stronger than expected economy, but also the tax revenues of this largest share of the economy has rarely happened in modern fiscal history, which means rarely happened ever, and only 2 or 3 times since World War II. So, as Kate pointed out, taxes aren't the problem here. And in particular, individual income taxes soared to 10.5% of the economy. Those revenues will fall down somewhat over the next 10 years by CBO's analysis, but they're still going to be above 18%, which is a very healthy amount. Now, spending is where the boom is. And why don't you break that down a bit, Kim?
Right. And the good point here just to make is that taxpayers are doing their fair share, okay? They're doing everything they were expected to and more. We have a government that's now taking a quarter of national income rather than its usual fifth. And so when the president complains about people not paying their fair share, he ought to take a look at these numbers. As you say, it's the spending side. It is now 24.8% of GDP. That is up from 21% over the 50-year average. And I think the really scary thing here is that while some of our pandemic programs are going away, that level of spending at GDP is set to basically continue up until about 2033, over the next foreseeable future. And what's also notable, Paul, is where that spending is going. So spending for defense is now at 3% of GDP, well down from its average of 4.3%. The only other times that it has been this low has been in 1940 and in the years of 1998 through 2001. And as our editorial pointed out today, you don't get any special marks for noting that one of those was right before World War II and one was right before 9/11. And those troughs ended up being a wake-up call, and we got back on the ball in terms of defense spending. But the money is really getting plowed into mandatory spending, which is now 16.3% of GDP. It's a new peak. It is way up from the 10.9% average. And the scary thing to me, Paul, is that mandatory spending, it's on autopilot. We are having a kind of weird national debate about it, and only in that the Biden team is accusing Republicans of wanting to get rid of mandatory programs. Not true, but we're not having a real debate about how we fix them. And with a bunch of baby boomers still getting ready to retire, those numbers likely are going to get worse.
It's a crucial point. When you say mandatory programs, you mean Social Security and the major healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid and CHIP and some other subsidies. They're on automatic pilot because you get them if you reach certain qualification levels, like age, for example, and some on income level in the case of Medicaid. And the perversity of the political moment is that even as they take ever more larger share of the economy, an ever larger share of the federal budget, we become less likely to even say, well, maybe we should try to reform them. Oh, no, can't do that. And so, as you say, 16.3% of the economy in mandatory spending, and it's going to fall a little bit here, as probably because Medicaid spending will fall as the healthcare emergency, the pandemic emergency ends. But then it's going to be back up by the end of the decade when people like me and other baby boomers decide to retire. And all I can say to the two of you is, we're going to get ours, but I'm not so sure you're getting yours.
So the answer, Paul, is we're not going to let you retire.
Well, but it's true. It's really a perverse kind of a state of affairs. And there was a greater political imperative and almost something of a consensus in the late 1990s that these programs should be reformed. But now, can't touch them, Kate.
Yeah, CBO says the Social Security Trust Fund is cruising towards insolvency within a decade, which would result in benefit cuts if it's not addressed. And it's increasingly looking like we are only going to deal with it in the event of a crisis. The other thing I'd add from Kim's point about, national defense and our spending there, some other factors to keep in mind. I mean, we've been writing a lot about how defense spending, given the world environment right now, should be closer to what it was during the Cold War, closer to 5 or 6% of GDP. But right now, it is being crowded out by all these other programs that we're discussing, and including net interest on the debt is going to overtake defense at some point on the current trajectory. And that will be even more rapid and acute if interest rates go up. So that is another example of where our spending is really out of whack. I mean, when we talk about, for instance, the last time we had 100% of debt held by the public of the economy, 100% of the economy, we're looking at years like the end of World War II.
1944, 1945.
Yes, right. And what were we up to then? What were we spending a lot of money on? It was our national defense. So I worry that we're now in this period that doesn't have a real parallel because we're really exhausting our capacity to spend, but we're not spending on our national defense. So that is just a really alarming set of factors. I would just add one more quick thing, which is that the CBO report and all projections rely on assumptions. And one assumption this report makes is that inflation will level off and be back about at 2%, I think close to 2025. So the damage here could be much worse than it looks, even if that doesn't materialize. So it's hard to believe that this might be the rosy picture, but it very well could be.